Hello, everyone, whether you're watching, whether you're listening. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Paul Taylor. Now, I should just say that Paul and I met almost, I think it was nearly about a year ago, wasn't it, Paul?
Yeah.
We were both invited to a seminar hosted by Richard Grannon. At that time, Paul was talking about language, the use of language, things like that. Since then, he started up a YouTube channel, Readers of the Lost Art, where he looks at art, narrative, communication, and things like that. Paul, I'm just going to leave this open. How would you best describe yourself? How would you best introduce yourself?
I In the introduction to my videos, I always call myself a recovering academic. I left academia in a huff because it turned into a crash for adult children. So that gives you someone. One of the comments, one of my subscribers described it as peak miserableism at my channel.
Okay.
So I look at art in various forms. I try and do everything. So not that I'm an expert by any means, but I try and bring in all the different types of art. So from sculpture to painting to plays to mythology. I'm increasingly beginning to look at fairy tales and folk tales. And I think the common strand is this idea of how important narrative and stories are to the human condition. But
Mhm.
we live in a post-literate age where increasingly we've never needed them more, but people are less able to access them.
Well, yeah, human beings, we do tend to learn through stories. We identify with characters and so on, and Jung would have called them the archetypes. We learn through we learn through the different characters. We can identify with them. I'm interested. You mentioned a post-literate age. What do you mean by that?
Well, from the starting back to front in the sense that I came from the university sector, and I'm not joking. I was at Russell Group University, Leeds University. My background, I went to Edinburgh University for my degree and my PhD. I studied in America at the University of Pennsylvania on a year-long scholarship. So I had quite a wide range of experience of different types of university in different countries. So I traveled quite a lot, gave a lot of talks. I stayed in Tampere in Finland for a month at a university. And over time, it was like watching a car crash. Or there's a German theorist called Walter Benjamin, and he had this beautiful notion, and he called it, this is to give a sense of how my channel is as well, the angel of death. And he based it on a Paul Klee painting, and it was this idea that there's been a massive explosion and an angel's being propelled backwards through time and space whilst it sees all these disasters on earth unfolding one after the other. And that's how I felt my academic career was. I was being blown backwards and watching students become less and less independent, less and less literate. So, and I'm not the only one. There's been evidence of people at Oxford and Ivy League schools in America saying they can't, in English literature, they can't set certain texts because they're too long or they're too difficult, and they've been setting them for decades, and all of a sudden it's increasingly difficult, and you're not, no one in your institution helps you because it's all about the customer now, and if you're telling the customer they need to work harder, that's not a good message. But even if you tell me if I'm wrong, when regularly people criticize me online, half the time I know they're criticizing me, but I'm not even sure what they're saying because they're illiterate, and I don't mean to sound snippy, but if human beings in modern Western democracies can't communicate clearly, if only to express disagreement, I don't know whether it's this dependency upon images. People that, ironically, there's never been so much text flying around in the ether, but people are less and less able to construct coherent sentences. Their vocabulary is more limited. This is all my experience at the top end of the the higher education system, and from what I've read at lower levels, there's young children who are going to school finding it more and more difficult to recognize facial emotions on teachers and things
What
because for whatever reason kids are growing up in semi-autistic environments.
do you mean by
Um,
semi-autistic environments? What do you mean?
well, for example, the universal babysitter, they will be left with a tablet, or they will learn to play on imitation mobile phones almost as soon as they're able to, stumble about. And they're not told stories before they go to bed, which sounds such a ridiculously simple thing, but they're immersed almost like they leave the womb and then they enter this matrix of mater is Latin for the mother, and matrix as in cyberspace and matrix as in social media. This is what they then move into, and they're not living in the real world. And I'm older than you, so I'm getting on for 58. But I often think, everyone, all these old fogies always moan it was better in my time. I'm not actually claiming that. What I'm saying is, I grew up before there were these things, so I know what it was like before. And these kids, they've grown into it and have no frame of reference beyond it. And that's such an obvious point, but it only struck me relatively recently that what I find so difficult to understand about people being so dependent about online existence. So, for example, kids might get bullied, and
Mhm.
my immediate response online, and my immediate response, well, why don't you just take them offline? They can't be bullied if they're not online. And if you said that to a parent, they'd look at you shocked. Oh, they have to go online. Their life's online. And there just seems to be this catch-22 of all the bad things about online existence, and we don't seem to be able to control because we don't realize there are alternatives, because it seems so all-encompassing and all-demanding.
Well, you said you're older than me. I will say you're older than me by a whisker.
All right, well, that's great. You just look a lot younger. You have a haircut and you shave.
There is something you say whenever kids, well, we all learn by doing, and kids learn by playing. And I remember when I was young, you same generation of me, you'll recognize this. You had things like dolls, action figures, Action Man, things like that, and we would have learned by having the figures interact with each other, not just do things. So what I'm hearing from you is nowadays kids are looking at a screen where it's just being played out for them. Would that be fair enough to say?
Yeah, so there's a lack of imaginative input. And another, this is maybe counterintuitive. I don't know about you, but I remember during my childhood quite long periods being bored out my head. And the kids aren't allowed to be bored. And I'm like a champion of, and maybe people will say this after they see any of my videos, but I'm a champion of boredom in the sense that I think it's a necessary psychological experience. And that there's lots of historical examples of famous inventors, etc., having revelations when they're at the end of their tether, bored out their skull, not thinking about work, or it just strikes me as it's a natural part of the human condition that we've taken away, because kids either are 24/7 online, or they're being ferried from supervised event to supervised event. I understand the world's, in some senses, is less safe than it might have been. But I remember in the summer holidays just being left to roam feral in Liverpool for days on end. And you'd come back for your dinner, and your parents might vaguely know where you were, but you were quite independent from quite a young age. And you had to make your own entertainment. And tell me, I've got a genetic ASBO. I don't have kids, so I'm not an expert by any, imagine by any measurement whatsoever. But tell me whether I'm off beam here. Kids, everything is structured for them, whether online or offline. Where is their own imaginative input into building up their own psychology? I don't see it.
What they would want to do, what they would like to try. That's what you mean?
Yeah, and so, for example, I'm sorry because it happens to be what I've been reading a lot about at the moment. Fairy tales. Insofar as kids are exposed to fairy tales, they tend to be bowdlerized versions. And I was doing a video where I showed some. I know it's not strictly a fairy tale, but Alice in Wonderland, and I used some of the original illustrations.
Hmm.
And they're very simple ink drawings, but they're beautiful. And one of the little animals that Lewis Carroll describes is called the bread and butterfly. Its head is made of a sugar cube, and it feeds on a creamy tea. But the immediate irony is, in order to feed, its head's going to dissolve when it goes into the tea, because its head's a sugar cube. And Alice in Wonderland is full of quite dark images like that, and the black and white ink drawings, you have to fill them in with your own imagination. And I juxtaposed it in one of my videos with the Disney version of the bread and butterfly, and It doesn't have the sugar cube head, and it's schmaltzy and it's pretty colors, and kids aren't getting that enigmatic darkness that
Hmm.
fairy tales are absolutely full of. Another example, I remembered it out the blue. I don't know whether you ever remember it. It's on YouTube. If you do a search for Sinbad and the skeletons, there was a old coloured film called Sinbad's. It was a Sinbad the Sailor or Sinbad. And there's a point at which these he's fighting, some skeletons come up from the ground,
Hmm. I
and the
vaguely remember the
animation,
stop
yeah,
motion skeletons. Yeah, yeah.
and it's scary. But the animation, the point I wanted to make was the animation by modern standards is incredibly primitive. But these skeletons who are fighting the Greek soldiers, it's really eerie. Even as an adult now watching it, it's got an atmosphere to it that when I see Disney type animations, there's a coldness. The HD, there's immense detail, but there's a coldness that is anti imaginative, in my humble opinion. And I think if you're living your whole developmental psychological period when everything's being given to you imaginatively on a plate, where are your inner imaginative resources? And then you ask yourself why the younger generation has never been had so much recorded mental illness, mental anxiety. So it's not me just moaning for the sake of it. There are consequences that young people themselves are complaining about. And rather than just treat the symptoms, I think society is just ignoring the really important causes.
There's a podcast I listen to, which I think it talks about movies, talks about special effects in movies, and goes into depth and who was behind the model work, who made them, and so on, and how was this scene created. And one of the things they were talking about was CGI, and they were saying that these days nothing dates a movie more than CGI because you see the technology. You can see how the technology changes. But one of the things they said, which I thought was really interesting, they don't particularly like CGI, but what they said was where CGI works at its best is when it enhances model work and things like that. So I thought that was interesting because when it comes to the likes of the model work, there is hands-on building things like that, turning them, moving them, whatever the little moving parts and so on, and the CGI merely enhances that. So I guess what I'm saying when it comes to that is it's not that we go back to the pre-internet age, pre-digital age, but it's trying to find a balance of both.
And it's not. I just hasten to add, I taught cinema for quite a while,
Hmm?
partly ironically because students didn't read anymore. So I thought I'll try getting them to watch films. And if I can give an example, I am slightly bitter and twisted. I don't think there's a huge amount of good cinema out there. And it's a slightly dated example, but Christopher Nolan's Inception.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that has quite, at the time at least, it could be, what's it, 10, 15 years old now, I guess. But that's got, at the time, it was quite cutting edge CGI type technology. But that film is incredibly clever. It has um, slightly hidden references to Virgil's poem, The Aeneid, and going into the underworld because his wife wants to stay in dreamland,
Mhm.
and all these themes going on. And that would be an example of what you're talking about, the way in which the special effects, allied with a profound human story,
Mhm.
you've got the best of all possible worlds. But unfortunately, that isn't the standard. A counterexample, more positive, optimistic example, would be the number of foreign Netflix series I watch now. I'm watching an Austrian one. I've been watching a series of Polish ones. I've got a weird taste in Italian TV series that you can get on Netflix. So it's not all bad because we have such a smorgasbord available to us through things like Netflix. There is some profoundly good stuff.
Yeah.
But the legacy media, the institutions like Hollywood, I'm deeply, deeply cynical about because it is so homogenous, it is so manipulative, and it's so saccharine that I think I'm not alone. I think a lot of people have gone online. A lot of people rely on service providers like Netflix And it's a shame because that takes away. You will remember, like I do, watching almost like community events, watching mainstream television when millions of people in the country were watching the same thing, and that's what you talk about at the water cooler
Yeah.
or the over the tea urn in those days. You didn't have water coolers, far too bourgeois. But there was this shared community of reference points, which is
Mhm.
another element. When you lose literacy, everything becomes individualized and privatized because you have no common archetypes to refer to.
You're talking about what you have seen, but the other person might not have seen it, doesn't know the story. So you're talking
Yeah.
about.
So you can talk to friends and colleagues and you can say, have you seen such and such on Netflix? And they may make the effort to
Mhm.
go and watch it. And then you can have some type of conversation. But there was a time when, because there were so few channels and so little choice, you'd all see people went to the cinema much more often, 2 or 3 times a week. And there was a shared community sense, a set of reference points.
Mm.
Now everything is much more personalized and everyone's in politics, everyone's in their own little ghetto, silo, where we all look at the material that appeals to us. And this is exacerbated by the algorithm, which I would argue is a new form of the sacred. Because someone as cynical as me, and my channel is very bijou and small and insignificant. And I should be the one person on earth who can take that on the chin and not become obsessed by the algorithm. But if I put a video out, I'm religiously looking at the numbers in a really pathetic way because that's how insidious it is. You watch the little counter click, and this is, if you saw a primitive person from a tribe doing this, you'd think this is totemic. This is, this isn't rational. It's like a cargo cult. What will the algorithm give me today from the sky?
Yeah. It is something I find and something I do still have to be aware of sometimes. Yeah, you put a video out and I'm looking at it, and why did it not do as well as the last one? What did I do wrong with it? And I'm thinking that because that's some of the advice you're getting. If your video doesn't do as well, what did you not, compare it to the other ones? Or if this one did really well, what did you do different? What are people looking at? And we're constantly chasing that dopamine hit, if you will.
Yeah, but that's one. I totally agree. It's the dopamine hit that you, the producer, are seeking, but also what you've just said is the cause of homogeneity because you then pick a topic that you think will register because it's controversial, or you think, what did I do that wasn't successful last time? And you create all your content to meet the tastes of a bigger audience. And
Mm.
this will sound incredibly pompous, but on my channel, because I haven't monetized it and because it's a hobby and because it's quite difficult, pretentious stuff. So I don't really expect huge audiences. But
Mm.
if I start deliberately seeking a bigger audience, well, you're completely undercutting the purpose of doing the channel. Because I'm arguing there isn't enough fine art, there isn't enough good literature. So if I start doing, sex and scandal type videos, well, why am I on YouTube?
Yeah.
So I have to come to terms with the fact it's always going to be small scale. But the vast majority of YouTube output is chasing the dragon of
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
high count. But you get my point? That means everyone meets at the lowest common denominator in
Yeah.
terms of output.
And something about my channel that I've talked about with one or two other YouTubers. The stuff that I put out is largely requested by the people that watch me. Um, that being said, I do talk about things I want to talk about once in a while, but it's largely the stuff that people ask me to do. And I'm sometimes wondering if I stopped doing that and did start looking at what was getting really big, huge numbers again. But that would be, as you say, chasing the dragon, and that's not what I set out to do in the first place.
Yeah, maybe my perspective is because I'm this recovering academic. When academia was still strong, you, the professional academic, were trusted to
Hmm.
teach the students what you thought they needed rather than what they wanted.
Okay.
And that is what I try to do, and I understand it risks sounding incredibly pompous, but I know a lot of stuff that I know other people don't know, or they've never encountered it. So that's what I'd like to do, is to present that to them. And I'm very careful. It's not my personal opinion. I present material, and I use quite a lot of quotes from the original sources.
Mm,
So of course I'm giving my opinion quite often, but viewers can make their own mind up because I'm presenting them with the arguments of other people. I'm not trying to browbeat them into my opinion, but I'm always trying to pick things I think, well, I think this is fascinating, but I'm sure it's definitely not mainstream accessible.
mm.
Or, sometimes it is, but often it isn't. And I'd rather have a small audience who, like me, become fascinated by something than give them what they think they want. But actually, this is the double bind as well. People think they want stuff, and the minute you give it them, they're still dissatisfied because actually it isn't what they really want. What they really, really want, to quote the Spice Girls, but it's what they think they want. And our society is increasingly built upon these false needs. That affluenza is one of the main diseases in our society. All these things we think we want that actually, if we got rid of, would make our lives a lot calmer.
That's interesting you used the term false needs. Because immediately what came to mind as you were saying that, I was thinking of, the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Um, what do you mean by false needs? Because you think of the hierarchy of needs, he suggested we can't really progress until we get the level below us and so on. What do you think?
Well, in the sense that, and I don't want to sound like a raging old Marxist, but the idea that in the capitalist society we live in, and this isn't genuinely a left wing or right wing point, but I think you'd have to be born under a rock not to realize that a lot of the stuff we engage with in terms of material products, we don't need. So they're false needs in the sense that I am not claiming I'm holier than thou. I am gadget boy. If there is I've just bought a ridiculously expensive pepper mill called the Pepper Cannon from a company called Man Kitchen, and it's basically Freud would have a field day on the phallic symbolism of my purchase. But do I need the world's most efficient pepper grinder? Maybe I do, but I've survived to the age of 58 without it. But for a week, it's become my little toy. And this is what I mean by false needs. Some of them are fun. I'm not, I'm not anti-fun. I'm a wastrel in lots of ways. But there has to be a balance. And so much of our society, think false needs for communication. Let's make it a bit more abstract. When I see people on their mobile phone all the time, from all walks of life, and I still refuse to get one. So I actually have to use my wife's number to access various digital purchases and stuff. So increasingly, it's becoming more difficult to live a modern life without a mobile phone. But I'm doing my best. But when I watch other people on their mobile phones, I'm thinking, what are you looking at so intently? What are the messages that
Mm,
have made you not enjoy the sunset? Because I see people, I live in the countryside. I see people on walks looking at their mobile phones when there's a beautiful, beautiful sunset.
mm.
And I'm thinking, are they reading Proust on their mobile phone? I don't think so. So they're probably saying, what pie are we having for dinner to their loved one? Or is it snobbish to think that, there used to be a time when people could communicate the bare essentials of life without all this excess communication? I think we live in a society that thinks more communication is good, when actually, no. I think there is too much communication, and a lot of it is unnecessary, and people have become addicted. You talked about the dopamine hit. It's nice to have a little ping that someone's recognized your existence online. But what that really adds to your life, I'm not so sure.
Again, I think it's about balance. The belief, yeah, so that little ping we got, someone has acknowledged my existence. That's nice. We're going to feel good again. We'll get that little bit of a dopamine hit. I think where it goes too far, and this is where maybe you're talking about the far too much communication, is when we believe we're dependent on our sense of self-worth depends on who likes us, who validates us, who likes our stuff, or who comments, or who criticizes it constructively rather than, just hatred. I think that's when it starts to go a bit too far. You talked about the walking, the beautiful sunset, the countryside, and so on. Yeah, there is something to be said for that. Not being able to be in the moment, being
It
content
wasn't,
somewhere.
forgive me, because I'm so out of touch with contemporary culture, as every word that pours from my mouth seems to prove. But wasn't that they reinvented the idea of sitting on, for example, on a plane, just looking into space? What did they call that? Was it,
Hmm.
because my memory says something like dogging, but that means something distinctly different. But there was some phrase they invented.
For what it's worth, I used to think dogging had something to do with Yorkshiremen and their whippets. Turns out, no.
But they did, unless I'm imagining things, that there was a new trend where you sat on a plane or whatever and just looked into space and you didn't look at any mobile device or you didn't read a book, God forbid. And that was basically became a trend. And I'm thinking, so basically you've reinvented just being in the moment and relaxing. And that has to become a trend for people to start doing it. That, influencers are now influencing us to do what people have done since time immemorial. But if you give it a trendy name, it's almost your new patent. I just find it very, very odd.
Well, this
But
is,
can I ask you,
yeah,
sorry,
sure.
could I ask you a question about balance? Because the commonsensical response is that everything I'm moaning about, well, why don't you have a little bit and then, go away, read a book, or, moderation in all things. Diet or whatever always seems to be the most sensible thing. But go on a train, go on a plane, and look and see how many people are having a one to one conversation or reading a book in silence versus people scrolling through screens. And if a Martian came down to Earth, he or she would think it was an epidemic, because why are all these people doing exactly the same thing?
Mm.
And so I'm suggesting the balance to me theoretically is possible, but the nature of these communicational devices is they become all pervasive, ubiquitous, and invasive in our lives. I don't see very much. You have to be a right oddball like me who just refuses to get a mobile phone. The fact I'm on YouTube is a minor miracle, and I do spot the irony for someone who's criticizing all these things. But this balance, I don't see a lot of this balance that, like I say, is theoretically possible,
Mhm.
but that's not how technology tends to work.
No, well, it's like anything. It's even like your super amazing superhero pepper mill thing.
A
Uh,
pepper cannon.
the pepper cannon. I do beg your pardon. I didn't mean to devalue your new. Um, we like nice things. We human beings were designed, evolved, whatever term you want to call it. We are designed to like nice things, pretty things, beautiful things. We like good music, nice pictures, beautiful sunsets. We like nice looking people. We like delicious food. We like nice things. It's how we're hardwired. There is something in us as well that likes, let's go back to what you said a moment ago, the nice, bright, shiny things, the new things, the shiny things, the things that does something interesting. For what it's worth, I like things that make noises when you push buttons too. I like. um, but this is where this is where I would maybe think about the balance. It's knowing we like these things, but do we necessarily need them? It's okay to have it as a desire, as a want, as a preference, but it's not actually a need. And it's being able to discern the difference. And we're not necessarily saying no to ourselves, because there are some things we do want to have. You see over my shoulder in that cabinet there. Um, well, I collect antique toys, spaceships, cars, things like that. And every now and again, I will see one online or in a shop or something, and there is part of me wrestling. It's nice because I don't have it. I remember having one when I was a kid. I remember my mate having one and me being envious. And there is one. It's for sale. It's not in great condition, etc., etc. But then there's the other part of me going, "Where are you going to put it? What do you actually want it for? What are you going to do with it? Do you want it because you like it, and because you want it and you want to add it to your collection, or is it just this need you have to add?" to it. You have to have something you didn't have previously. So that's what I mean by trying to find that balance, trying to, if you will, that internal negotiation.
Yeah, and desire as a psychological concept is fascinating because it's inherently relational. So you need to have a gap between what you want or you think you want and yourself. So the minute you're satiated, by definition, it's difficult to be desirous still. So after one of my huge, desperate Dan-sized nightly steaks, even I don't want any more steak. Um, and that is once desires are satiated. But the flip side of that is we live in a society where desires are constantly titillated, and they're often not things that can satiate us so that we can stop desiring them. They're things that are designed to permanently titillate us and make us salivate. And that's what I think's unhealthy. It's
Mm.
fine to have desires for things. That's part of the natural human condition. But I don't think your average caveman had a Raquel Welch type cave woman permanently on the horizon. Sorry, my mind went off then. So what was that film, 2000 BC?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
It's a very dated. If there's any of your viewers old enough to remember Raquel Welch in a an animal skin bikini, which was obviously what cave women wore those days, they'll
Yeah.
know where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
But I think I've just revealed far too much of my inner psyche.
Where your mind goes. I wonder what you're saying. I don't know if this is too strong a word, or I don't know if this is even the right word, but I wonder if what you're talking about is um, almost like a form of hedonism. It's the instant gratification, the instant pleasure, the wanting something right here and now, the desire.
It is, but it's a weird form of hedonism that can never be satisfied. So
Yeah.
I did a video recently about the Bop House, which I'd never encountered before, which is some online like reality TV environment, but
Okay.
it's for OnlyFan adult actresses. So they're basically pimping out their work, their oeuvre, if I may call it that, in a reality TV type format. And then you've had Lily Phillips and people like that
Mm,
seeking these records for mechanical copulation to the nth degree.
mm,
And it strikes me that it's an empty form of hedonism because one of the aspects of desire that's enjoyable is it not being fully met. So it's the fact that there'll always be a better steak than the one I just had. So I try and cook better and better steaks. I've got Wagyu steaks all the time at the moment.
mm,
And part of the enjoyment is some subliminal awareness that you will never have the perfect steak. But isn't it fun trying? Versus this hedonism where you actually try and have sex with 1,000 people, which any normal, sensible person would know is not going to bring you happiness. It's not going to bring you enjoyment. It's what we're doing, chasing the algorithm in a bizarre physical way. And that's what's pathologically not normal.
mm. I wonder is part of it as well, going back to that hierarchy of needs. I wonder how much of that is trying to skip a layer, uh, going straight towards the self-esteem and maybe trying to skip out what's underneath, ignore what's not there underneath, like maybe the connection or a sense of safety or something.
Well, can I give you two examples of that? One is the boredom example I previously referenced. It's going straight to the enjoyment without realizing in order to enjoy fully, you have to have a frame of reference that includes boredom.
Mm,
So if you've been bored and then you indulge in something incredibly exciting, the boredom part of your life acts as a useful frame of reference that makes the enjoyable thing even better.
mm.
And a practical example of that, you're going to laugh at me now, but if you ever remember Purple Quality Streets,
I do, yeah.
yeah, for
I think it's
non-British
open in the.
viewers, well, for non-British viewers, Quality Street with these old-fashioned sweets in wrappers, chocolates with fillings, various fillings, and there was a purple one. They're mixed. And when I went to the newsagents years ago, you used to be you'd get given a collection of them in a bag, but you couldn't pick your favourites. You were given what you were given, and The purple ones were chocolate with caramel and a Brazil nut inside. And most people thought they were the best. And then years later, I just remember seeing in a shop you could buy whole bags of just the purple ones. And it sounds like such a silly point, but that's emblematic of a society that won't make you eat four chocolates you're not that bothered about to get the glorious chocolate you've always wanted. Now you just go straight, to your point, you go straight to the purple quality street.
Mm.
Where's the delayed gratification? Where's the satisfaction? I ate four rubbish chocolates, so I could have this one.
Yeah, there is something to be said for delayed gratification, and it's something that you see. Well, I think we're all guilty of it to some degree when it comes to things like procrastinating and so on. But there is something about that quick and easy fix. We want the instant gratification. We're delaying the longer term a lot of the time in what we do, or the short term. Just like, as you say, buying the bag full of the ones that you like, rather than pick through a box. No, I don't want that one. Yeah, I'll keep that one for later. That's an option. I'll keep that one. Yeah, it's
I think psychologically, another aspect of all this, so to make it slightly more profound than chocolates, but it does remind me of Forrest Gump's laughs, a box of chocolates. There is this idea of explanation. So I don't know how you find in your professional life.
Mhm,
People want explanations all the time.
mhm,
And what I've found by looking at things like fairy tales and myths are they're inherently ambiguous and enigmatic, and they resonate with people. So a fairy tale will resonate with a child, and often the child won't understand the
mhm,
full meaning of the story, and they can't because they're quite ambiguous by their nature. And for adults, if you read Ovid's Metamorphoses and you read the myths, the Greek myths, there's very arbitrary interactions by the gods. There's very puzzling aspects to them.
mhm.
But when people want therapy, they want answers, they want explanations, they want general principles, they want to
Oh,
know,
mm,
why am I in a narcissistic abusive relationship? What is the formula by which I can make sense of what's happening?
yeah.
When actually, I'd argue that what great art, literature, fairy tales, mythology, all these things is help us make contact with our unconscious, not fully aware of what's resonating with us, but
Yeah.
having some sense that we're in touch with things that we can't fully understand or control. And that's an aspect of modern contemporary life that's increasingly rare. So you have this weird situation. People then keep wanting answers to things that don't lend themselves to ready, simple answers. And I would think that would lend itself to, in turn, to quite profound disappointment, disaffection, frustration, a lot of these mental symptoms that we see in society at large.
Human beings, as a rule, I think, we do not like things that don't make sense. We are probably the only animal on the planet that needs to know things we don't know. We need to know what to do whenever we don't know what to do, whenever we're stressed, whenever we're in trouble. We do not like things that don't make sense. And what I have noticed, and there has to be some literature on this somewhere, I really need to look at this. In fact, I'm sure our mutual friend Ed Dutton would probably have some info on us. He has info on everything in the world. um, when something happens, we're in some kind of danger. There's some kind of threat. Even if it's disturbing, even if it's distressing, sometimes we might freeze, we might run, we might fight. One way or another, we have different responses. Sometimes we might be in a situation, it's like maybe a car accident or something, so it is something that happens and we are in some kind of danger. And it is still frightening. There is the fear of what could have happened, never mind what did happen. I believe that one of the, if not the most, one of the biggest things that cause us pain, misery, and distress is other people. We do not like, in spite of all the war movies and in spite of all the hero movies and all the James Bond movies and stuff, human beings, I don't believe, are hardwired for things like cruelty, malice. malicious intent. We find that hard to make sense of. So you could be in a situation with someone who is brutally violent. That doesn't make sense, but you kind of get a sense of there's danger there, stay away. Doesn't matter what's going on with them internally, doesn't matter what she's doing, whatever, just keep away because that's danger. But when the danger is more psychological or emotional, that really doesn't make sense to us. That has us, again, we don't like things that don't make sense. And that's when we start replaying interactions, replaying conversations. We're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And sometimes, someone might get a sense of closure. Well, it turns out, they tick a lot of boxes. They must have been narcissistic, or they must have been psychopathic, or they must have been whatever. That can help with a sense of closure because it helps put something into a perspective. An example I used recently on a live stream at how this can keep us stuck because we keep going over the same thing and we want to know more and more about the narcissist. We want to know more and more about the psychopath. We want to know more and more. Again, we're getting like a little bit of a dopamine hit. The example I used was actually someone else on social media had posted up something. It was just a picture, and I thought about it. It was really interesting. And what it was is, it's like if you imagine a snake bites you. Now, what you do, it's like following the snake around. The poison's seeping through you, and you're following the snake around asking why it bit you. Instead of addressing the actual wound, instead of addressing what's going on with you. And sometimes what happens, you'll go on YouTube, what kind of snake was it? Oh yeah, well it was that's what those snakes do. Well, there's another kind of snake which is a bit like it. Do you know what I mean? We just keep on chasing that more and more information, trying to find something that makes sense. And in the meantime, we are taking the focus off ourselves, and the poison is still seeping through us, doing its damage. Get an idea of who and what it is you're dealing with. If it's a snake, it's a snake. Call it a snake. It is what it is. You can find out what kind of snake it is afterwards, once you've done a bit of work on yourself, once you've had a bit of support, once you've started to rebuild connection and things like that. I just went off on a complete tangent there, Paul. I do
No,
apologize.
no, that's fascinating. And I'm in total agreement. But and what struck me as you're speaking is what I referred to. So with your experience of people coming to you about problems with narcissistic abuse, our mutual friend Richard Grannon, when we did our talk together in Liverpool, which the general theme was a conference on narcissism.
Mm.
Do you remember when I gave my talk? I started it by asking the audience how many people had ever read the original myth of Narcissus. And I think Ed put his hand up because Ed would have to, even if he hadn't read it. But in the actual attendees, I don't think anyone had
Mm.
read. Now, again, that might seem, well, you're just being a pompous academic. But as an academic, and if I was a person who'd paid good money to go to a conference about narcissism, all my brain would be screaming out would be to find, where did the phrase come from?
Mm.
What's its history? What's its origin? Why did Freud borrow this term?
Mm.
And the fact that people aren't doing that is partly what I did my channel. I started it because it strikes me there's a gap, there's a deficit of information and knowledge and cultural resources that have been condensed in the wisdom of tradition and generations, in visual art and literature, all these things. But I'm not saying it's a pure substitute. People who are suffering chronically need professional help. I would never, say otherwise. But in the interim, all those people who have a passing interest or personal interest in the concept of narcissism, why wouldn't you flesh out your understanding with the wider cultural resources? And if anyone says, well, they're irrelevant, well, if they're irrelevant, why is it such a profoundly provocative, resonant notion, narcissism? The fact it's rooted in Greek mythology isn't accidental,
Mm.
because that's what myths do. They encapsulate and they condense human experience. And human beings have changed over thousands of years. But in essence, are we that different? There's this very clever condensation of human psychology in the myths.
Mm.
And it's your point about balance. I am all for modern psychiatry, modern psychology, But why would you throw the baby out with the bathwater? Why would you also ignore some of these archaeological roots of some of our most important ideas? And that's the deficit that I'm just constantly banging on about,
Yeah.
that seems to be lacking in a society that really could do with it.
And there's two things come to mind just as you're saying that. First of all, again, the legend of Narcissus. I'm sure I haven't come to some huge epiphany that no one has ever thought of before, but it did come to me once, and I thought, there we go. Narcissus fell in love with his reflection. Reflection is nothing. It is surface level. There's no depth or substance to it. That's what he fell in love with. And that's what you're dealing a lot of the time with narcissism, something surface level. There is no depth or reality to it. And that reflection is very easily disturbed. Slightest ripple, you know. The other thing I was thinking as you were saying, and I thought this was interesting, even the concept of Othello syndrome. You know what I mean by that, the idea of the jealousy,
The green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds upon,
yeah,
yeah.
and where that comes from. And someone might, again, they might say the word Othello. Well, what does that mean? But again, it's where that comes from. As you say, the Shakespeare play. So you're right. It's where these terms come from, what they mean, how we identify them.
And well, there's a guy, Bruno Bettelheim, who I've been looking at, who deals with, he wrote a brilliant book called The Uses of Enchantment, which is all about fairy tales. But he also wrote a book called Freud and the Soul of Man. And his point is, it's about how Freud has been largely, not totally, but largely appropriated by particularly US American psychoanalysts and made into a scientific project. And it's been medicalized. Psychoanalysis has been medicalized.
Mm,
And Bettelheim was from, I think he was about 50 years after Freud. He came from the same Viennese Jewish community. And he was saying that despite the age gap, he still had a very similar education to Freud. And he was very aware of the particular way Freud used various phrases and used various concepts like mythology. And he said the way Freud has been translated in English repeatedly downplays the humanistic, the cultural elements of Freud's work and makes it sound more medically sounding than it actually was. And I think this fits with what we're talking about, the notion we need explanations. American psychoanalysts wanted the patina of medical certitude, whereas Freud was much more at ease with the unknowability. We could go deep into the dark depths of the id, and we're never going to control it fully, but maybe we could learn to deal with it slightly better. But he
mm,
was never promising a rose garden. It was that Tammy Wynette. he was, it was never going to be a quick fix,
mm,
but he's providing the humanistic tools to learn a little bit about what you're describing. So you're totally right. People don't really understand true evil because it's not in most people's nature. But when you explore not just the Greek myths, but I've mentioned Virgil's Aeneid poem, and Dante's The Divine Comedy. There's a concept in literature called catabasis, which means going down. It's traveling down. It's a journey deep. And lots of mythologies are about going deep into the earth. So I think I've mentioned to you off camera,
mm,
I've been doing a bit of work on the Minotaur and the labyrinth at Knossos, which to me is a brilliant representation of the dark id. And all these ideas, if you read enough of this literature, the idea that there are dark realms of the human psyche
mm,
becomes second nature almost. Whereas I think what you're describing sometimes about people who want these quick answers is that it's what you're talking about. They're permanently surprised that people can have a dark nature.
mm,
When if they were more well versed in the classics, I don't think they'd be so surprised. And I think they'd have a better chance of distancing themselves, going into, effective flight from these dangers,
mm.
rather than like a moth around a flame,
And
constantly
recognize,
circling.
yeah, they recognize them. What you're saying is sounds very much like what Jung described as our shadow self. He talked about the stuff that's in our edge. He talked about our shadow self, the parts of us, the aspects of us that are unacceptable, not just to other people, but to ourselves as well. And the thing about our shadow self, I talked about this previously. We think our shadow self are all the things or parts of us just because they're unacceptable. We think they're bad, and they're not necessarily, because they may have been things we were led to believe were bad. Such as maybe your ambition or your conscientiousness or your desire to play an instrument or do something, whatever it is, or to be assertive. A lot of the time, the things that get pushed into the shadow are the things we are led to believe are bad. Which is why Jung was talking about we need to learn to integrate our shadow because we
So
need.
I'm having a senile elderly moment, but was it a guy, a psychoanalyst called Kohut,
Oh, good.
Kohut?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh,
but his notion that actually a little bit of narcissism is needed.
yes. At the
You know,
very,
ego psychology. Yeah, the idea that you can't be narcissistic whatsoever is for the birds. You have to have
you have to have a
a
level
well
of
developed sense of ego.
self-interest. I do call it self-interest, healthy self-interest. It's what is in your best interest. Where we sometimes, again, if you look at things like extremes, it's either one or the other. It's always a dichotomy of some kind. There's nothing in between. What you need is to pay attention to yourself. What you need, what you want, what your ambitions are, what your drives are, what's good for you, things like that. If you do that far too much, that's when we're going into the realms of selfishness and narcissism. We also, at the same time, we have to pay attention to other people. Is what we're asking for reasonable? What's it going to cost them? The things that they're asking me for, again, are they reasonable? Are they fair? If we spend too much effort and too much focus over there, we're people pleasing. We could become doormats. So going back to where we started, balance, it's trying to find the balance in between. We need that healthy level of self-interest. Again, Richard, once I heard him talk on one of his videos. Sometimes, at the very minimum, it's your survival instinct. There's a shark in the water. You're not going to. I'm not afraid of no shark. No, no, it's your survival instinct. It's in your best interest to get out of the water. And sometimes that's all it is. But the term narcissism, we talk about the narcissist, and I've been guilty of this because I've done it myself. It just becomes a turn of phrase. And more recently, I started to talk about um, narcissistic people because to me, I don't know about you, but when I hear the narcissist, to me, that's like there's one. There's only one narcissist on the whole planet, and this one narcissist gets into relationships with everybody. No, it's narcissistic people.
Yeah, and I think my interest, because I don't come from a psychology background, my interest is how, and I've briefly talked with Richard about it on a few occasions, but the extent to which our society provides the perfect breeding ground
Yeah.
for, if not fully blown NPD, at least it facilitates narcissistic behavior because of some of the things we've already spoke about, the false needs, the shallowness of the environment we're living in. It privileges and rewards short-term selfish behavior rather than longer-term delayed gratification, investment of time and effort. But as you were speaking, I was also thinking about, the need to be a little bit selfish. Would I be right in thinking that if you become too much of a people pleaser, it can actually drift over into passive aggressive by
Mhm.
pleasing people too much and always giving them what they want and not actually providing for yourself is a shortcut to not actually having to take responsibility to build up your own sense of self and character.
It,
It's a bizarre way. It might be a way of avoiding having to take responsibility for yourself,
it,
which
it
in a bizarre way is a form of selfishness itself.
well, if you again, if we were to take that, and we were to apply that to maybe the Cartman triangle, the drama triangle, the rescuer, the persecutor, and the victim. The rescuer believes at their very core, I am good, because good people do good things. Not necessarily recognizing sometimes the difference between a good thing and the right thing, but I am good because I do good things. Um, we mentioned just before recording, we were talking about Ellis and his irrational beliefs, and one of them is actually other people are my responsibility. So that could be the people pleaser. There could be an element of that. It's up to me to make sure everyone's okay. Um, Other people are much more important than me. There can be that. What you were saying about if I put it this, it's like the abdication of responsibility, maybe. Um, there can be, if I'm fixing you, I don't have to pay attention to myself. If I'm fixing you, it's like I'm fixing myself vicariously. There can also be a kind of a codependency. If I bring out the best in you, you will see the best in me. So it is still transactional. Again, the rescuer on the triangle. Good people do good things. I will do good things for you. I will help you. I will support you. I will encourage you. I will do all the things you need because then I don't have to look at myself and I will feel good vicariously through you.
And to give a daft example, if you think on when you do the safety drill on an aircraft, mothers are told to put their own oxygen masks on before they try and help their children.
That's right. Yeah.
So I think what you're talking about is the psychological equivalent of that.
Mm.
If you don't look after yourself, then anything you do isn't treating the ultimate cause, it's just messing about with the symptoms.
How do you pour from an empty cup?
That's a Buddhist koan, isn't it?
Isn't it? um, Going back to what we were saying previously, yes, it's about trying to find that balance. We have to pay attention to ourselves, but we also have to pay attention to other people. And it's trying to find how we navigate that sometimes. Sometimes it's going to require sacrifice. We have to sacrifice something for ourselves, for maybe others, the greater good, our loved ones, things like that. But then other times we have to say no. These things aren't always easy to navigate. Well, I'm aware of the time. I know we've been talking just over an hour, and it's something I feel that we could probably spend another hour or two with.
Oh, at least.
But I really enjoyed our chat today. I think there is much more we could cover, maybe at some point in the future, if you'd be up for it.
I'd like to propose at some point, no hurry whatsoever, but it would be lovely to sit down and maybe look at something like, Oedipus Rex, Sophocles' play,
Mm,
as an opening for the whole notion of Freud's Oedipus complex, or
maybe.
look at the myth of Narcissus and get your input as a therapist and my input as a pompous academic and see how they blend. But rather than just talk about the importance of all these things, actually do a practical little
I think
something manageable.
I think I would enjoy that. That would sound very interesting.
Yeah, slightly off, off piste, but all the more valuable for being off piste.
I'm going to leave you with something. It's what I've noticed. Being a Liverpudlian, you have very similar to the Irish, especially the Northern Ireland, a very self-deprecating kind of humor. It's just we both it seems to manifest differently in both of us.
Well, I grew up, there weren't that many enough. I had three other siblings, so there's four of us. And it was just a Scouse family whereby it wasn't possible to get too far above yourself. You were knocked down very quickly. So I think you just imbibe that type of upbringing.
Well, listen, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Don't forget, you can find Paul on Readers of the Lost Art. He's on YouTube, and most Mondays you're also a guest on The Jolly Heretic as well.
But I'd advise people, if they're going to watch The Jolly Heretic, they should have a stiff whiskey before doing so.
And on that note, we'll leave it. Take care, Paul. We'll speak soon.
All the very best.